Hello everyone, it's Melissa Sweet here, public health journalist from Croaky. We're coming live to you from Canberra, and I'm really delighted that we have here today to speak to you Janine Mohamed from Katzenham and Professor Roianne West from Griffith University and Katzenham. And hello Daniel James, who's just joined us immediately. How lovely that you're here with us.
Hi Daniel.
Just like to acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal country and Ngambri country, and we've been busy over the last few days doing a writers' retreat. But first of all, I'll just get some introductions. So Janine, can you please tell us who you are and a bit about yourself in Katzenham?
Sure. Janine Mohamed, I'm an Urunga woman, which means I'm from the Yorke Peninsula in South Australia, more importantly, Point Pearce Mission. I'm the CEO of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses, or Katzenham. So Katzenham in a nutshell is a peak professional body representing the interests of Aboriginal nurses and midwives, and we also have a membership of non-Indigenous nurses and midwives and organisations who are great supporters of Katzenham. So that makes up the body of Katzenham, and we have, I'm really proud to say, over 900 members now at Katzenham.
Fantastic. And Professor Roianne, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thanks, Melissa. My name is Roianne. My people are the Callout people from northwest Queensland, where Mount Isa now resides, and I'm currently the Foundation Professor of First Peoples Health at Griffith University.
Fantastic. And I'll just scan up on the wall where there's a lot of notes about the discussions over the last few days about the importance of getting discussions out into wider spheres around cultural safety. So why have we been having this writers' retreat?
Well, initially we needed the writers' retreat because Katzenham has been doing some really great work in the space of privileging the aspirations of Indigenous nurses and midwives into policy and position statements, a lot of grey material, and we felt it was time to actually come together and think about some thematics around our work so that we can boost the availability of this thinking into a wider sphere, that being academia, into online publications. And so a writers' retreat was a good way of just having a think tank, really, hey Roianne, to come up with those thematics. What was the low-hanging fruit that we could begin to talk about? And certainly one of those was cultural safety, a very important issue to Katzenham, and think about who we might want to publish with in terms of other writers and in what publications we might want to do that. But it was certainly about, in a nutshell, raising our members' voices into these spaces, getting a public conversation going, and thinking about where we might want to publish and who with.
And I guess one of the discussion points has been, what is cultural safety? How do we define it? How do we understand it versus some other terms that are common? Would you like to elaborate on that?
For me, the Writers' Retreat was important given that the concept of cultural safety was adopted into Australia a couple of decades ago, and it's been used in numerous different contexts and defined in a number of different ways. To date, the conversation has been very dominated by non-Indigenous people, and this last couple of days has been an opportunity to work towards privileging Indigenous nursing and midwifery voices in a very targeted way, and that's cultural safety in Indigenous health settings.
And what's the difference, for example, between cultural safety and another term we hear a lot, which is cultural awareness?
Yes, a good point, Melissa, because I think that's another thing that we're trying to clarify in this writing, that we're not all on the same page with regards to terminology. So one thing I always say is cultural safety is very much grounded in Indigenous knowledges, so cultural awareness certainly isn't. So the way that I describe cultural safety when comparing it to cultural awareness is othering, so looking at Aboriginal people and saying that they're different to us, and also at times probably not discussing power imbalances, not discussing racism, and therefore the person enacting cultural safety, so the individual, is looking outwards and actually not looking at themselves. So cultural safety is knowing thyself, really. We did cultural safety training at Katzenham. The biggest misnomer that people have when they come in is that they're going to learn about Aboriginal people and all of our nuances. And if you look at Tyndale's map, there's over 700 different languages there, and you can never know all there is to know about Aboriginal people. In fact, I would go as far as to say I don't know all there is to know about Aboriginal culture. So that's a misnomer, and there's no tick list about how to treat an Aboriginal person. So cultural safety definitely is about the inward gaze, being reflective, talking about racism, considering your attitudes and where they come from, looking at systemic racism and our responsibility in changing systemic racism.
Dr. Ramsden describes 3 stages in cultural safety, and step 1 is cultural awareness, step 2 cultural sensitivity, and step 3 is actually the outcome is achieving cultural safety. So for me, that's how I articulate the distinct difference between awareness, and we're in a country now in 2017 where we're about actually just knowing about cultural safety. It's about actually then the application of that I think is also missing in the conversation so far.
So where are we at in terms of applying cultural safety in Australia?
Sadly, still at the very beginning, still getting caught up in the terminology. And this is a conversation I often have, is that in 2017 we're still talking about what's the right terminology to use rather than what does this actually look like when it's embedded within our systems and our processes and individually as well. So I think we've got quite a long way to go, and that is also another outcome, hopefully another one of the aims of this last couple of days is really taking stock of where we're at in regards to the conversation and taking back ownership of the conversation. So Irahapati Ramsden was a Māori nurse, and it was conceived out of a colonial experience of an Indigenous person, and it sort of lost its way in Australia, and this retreat is about bringing it back to a conversation that's being led by Indigenous nurses and midwives.
So what would you like to see? How we know that we are making real progress in implementing, enacting cultural safety?
I think how we'll know is what we see wrong at the moment, which is the statistics. Aboriginal people have the highest burden of disease, and yet we have an underutilisation of health services. If we have cultural safety in place, we should see that a change in that. We certainly see at the moment where health services provide a culturally safe environment, people will drive past 2 major hospitals to get to that health service 120 kilometres away. So I think that it will not just be something that we see in statistics. Aboriginal people vote with their feet, so I think that will be one way.
Yeah, and we've been talking also about cultural safety applied across governance, that it's not only about the interaction between an individual patient and clinician or service. So how is cultural safety expressed in the governance of health services and health policy?
So what we see at the moment is where Aboriginal people should be represented in spaces such as hospitals, where we have the disproportionate levels of illness or burden of disease. We don't see Aboriginal nurses in leadership positions within hospitals. We don't see Aboriginal people on the governance systems within these hospitals. Therefore, we're not affirmed in these spaces. And as I discuss in many of the presentations that I do, is that this isn't privileging Indigenous people's voices, and we're not being affirmed in these environments that make decisions on our behalf. And if we want Aboriginal health to be improved, it's about self-determination, us in the leadership position and other people following us in our aspirations.
Sadly, Indigenous representation across leadership positions is still looked at as an equality issue. So that we only need our 3%, like milk, 3% fat type scenario, and I get sick of hearing that. And I think the conversation needs to move more than just to be an equality issue. If Indigenous people are misrepresented across all sectors of the health service, that our workforce should reflect what that proportion actually is like, not just the proportion of Indigenous people that occupy this country. And cultural safety needs to be embedded, because in order for individuals to enact culturally safe practice, they need the leverages within the systems that they work within to facilitate that actually playing out.
Yeah, it's that case of if we are 3% of the population, yet we receive, the worst outcomes from racism, then it's the other 97% who have all the responsibility and the power stepping into that and enacting cultural safety.
Yeah.
And now I know that you're hoping to do some journal articles around these issues, so here's your chance to do a call out to journal editors. What would you like to say? You're looking for nursing journal editors or general journal editors? What would you like to say to them?
From me personally, I think that nursing is an area that really needs to take up the conversation around cultural safety, and in particular the role of nurses. Given that nurses make up the greatest percentage of Australia's health workforce, I think there's a significant potential for nurses to be leading improvements in Indigenous health, and that is only possible if they have the necessary skills and capabilities to be able to actually provide culturally safe nursing care. So my call out would be to nursing and or midwifery journals to dedicate one of their next editions to cultural safety, specifically in nursing care and Indigenous health.
Fantastic. Would you like to add anything?
I think that there was a conversation that happened yesterday that was so enlightening, which is nursing and midwifery have such a focus on safety, I think you said, Roianne, but we don't actually put the same amount of resources, emphasis onto cultural safety, and I think I'm always about opportunity, and I think this is a great opportunity to embrace that and get behind it.
Thank you very much. Now, are there any final messages you'd like to put out before we wind up?
No.
Okay.
All good.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Janine, Mohamed and Professor Roianne West from Catston for talking to us today. This will just take a few seconds to finish up.